An architect in a priest's cassock. The appointment that changed the studies of Kiev students. The adventure that allowed Kiev to recover the metropolitan status. The National Museum of Ukrainian History. Over its more than a century-long history, it survived several revolutions and 2 world wars. Like a kind mother, it waited for the return of its children, priceless exhibits from forced emigration. It saw the ups and downs of the Ukrainian state, and it will remember for the rest of its life the suicide of the foster father and curator of the museum Shcherbakivsky, which was provoked by the Bolsheviks. A ceremonial cart drawn by 3 horses. A French-style cart, lightweight type of carriage, designed by 2 persons. Made in France at the beginning of the 18th century. 18th century France was the country that determined the fashion of those times, including the fashion of court ceremonies, palace design, gardens, and so on. France even set the standards for coaches. Construction material, various types of wood. So what kinds of wood were the wheels and the frame itself made of? Obviously, those were linden, oak, and spruce. External finishing material, linden. That is due to the fact that linden is very easy to decorate. The linden was then covered with levkas. Execution style, Rococo. The sign of Rococo is great solemnity in comparison with previous era, and the engravings on the body and the sides of the carriage were made in the Rococo style. In addition to engraving, there was also gilding and mirror glass, which aren't cheap. Equally as expensive as gilding and glass was their design. Who did this luxury vehicle belong to? How did it end up in the historical museum? And how did a Kiev archbishop manage to return the metropolitan status to the diocese? With the advent of Raphael Zaborovsky in the Kiev diocese in 1731, a large-scale transformation of the capital of Ukraine began. After all, the buildings that Raphael assisted with the construction of in many ways determined the face of the Baroque Kiev that we all know and appreciate today. But not only did the appearance of Kiev change, its inner world also did. A significant role was also given to education. It was he who created the so-called academic regulations for students and teachers of the Kiev-Mohyla Academy. A school order in a way determines how the teaching should take place and how the students' works and behavior should be evaluated. It was important for the education system of that time. He brought order to the educational process of the Kiev-Mohyla Academy. He even allocated something along the lines of grants for students, so they could continue studying abroad. Both students and professors received financial aid from the bishop's treasury, and the poor students for whom there wasn't enough space in the dormitories were accepted to Podillia parish schools. Raphael also ordered to incorporate the poorest students in temple service and, accordingly, give them a part of the church income. Such significant support of the educational process in Kiev led to the fact that the Kiev Mohila Academy was even called the Mohila Zaborovsky Academy during the tenure of Raphael Zaborovsky. Zaborovsky also didn't forget about the diocese that he was appointed to. The newly made archbishop eagerly took up the streamlining of church affairs. It was the leveling of various aspects, which can be called the corruption schemes in church life, when the priest governments were occupied mainly by the children of the priests who died. In other words, he also brought order to the internal church life. Raphael Zaborovsky is known as a preacher. He had a huge library, and that is how he impressed his contemporaries. Thanks to his wide erudition and education, Raphael Zaborovsky could teach his flock and his priests. So basically, he could ensure the further development of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as such. In addition to the fact that the Archbishop was a well-educated preacher, he was also an excellent diplomat. He used his talent for the benefit of the Kiev Cathedral. He was on friendly terms with the Central Imperial power, particularly with the Empress Anna Ivanovna and Elizabeth of Russia. That was despite the fact that the predecessor of Raphael in the Kiev Cathedral, Varlam Vanatovich, was subjected to repression by Anna Ivanovna. This was possibly due to the fact that, according to Ukrainian historiography, Varlam was the speaker for Ukrainian Orthodoxy in the 18th century. He became a martyr for the Ukrainian cause soon after. His replacement, however, was more accommodating in the matters of national and ecclesiastical orders. He even made his career in Russia, but he distinguished himself with special efforts in the fields of urban development, education, and the development of church as a whole. In truth, it was hard to talk about the Ukrainian issue under Empress Anna Ivanovna and her cruel lover Johann von Biron. It became somewhat easier in 1741, when Elizabeth ascended to the Russian throne. On August 12, 1742, 9 months after the coup, as the result of which she ascended to the throne, Zaborovsky together with the Kiev clergy petitioned the Empress to return them the metropolitan status. As is known, Elizabeth was an empress who treated Ukraine very favorably, since Alexei Razumovsky was her lover. By the way, this man was also close to Raphael Zaborovsky. Such Ukrainian patronage in St. Petersburg contributed to Elizabeth of Russia restoring the Kiev Metropolitanate. But it was not just St. Petersburg patronage that contributed to the restoration of the Metropolitanate. It was also the subtle diplomatic game of Raphael himself. He justified his request to the Empress by the fact that the Uniates indicated that the Ukrainian Uniates in Lviv had a Kiev Metropolitan by agitating the Orthodox believers, and the Orthodox didn't. The transition to Catholicism was a painful issue for the Holy Synod. So the body that proclaimed the unification of the Kiev and Moscow thrones and ordered not to print or utter the prayer for the very same unification 8 years prior then recommended the Empress to restore the metropolitan status of Kiev. In less than a year, on June 11, 1743, Elizabeth gave the green light. Another year later, she went to visit Kiev. It is interesting that the purpose of her visit refutes all those mantras which Moscow has been repeating for centuries, calling Ukrainians their smaller brethren. Back then, the imperial family perceived Kiev as a place where their ancestors originated from, as a historical place, as the first capital of the Russian Empire itself. Accordingly, that gave meaning and an ideological color to all those trips that they went on. She stayed in the chambers of the Archimandrite on the territory of the Kiev-Pechersk monastery. The Empress arrived in Kiev with a very impressive retinue. But what else can be said if she took almost 150 wagons on a simple bureaucratic trip to Riga? Her retinue consisted of 30 carriages of this kind. There were 10 more such wagons in reserve. On top of that, there were 90 simple carts, which according to the documents were used to transport all kinds of supplies. And that was Riga. Obviously, Elizabeth went to Kiev with a much larger cortege. Kiev would see a cortege even more pompous than this one in almost half a century, when the new Empress Catherine II arrived in the Ukrainian capital. You can only imagine the magnitude of traffic jams in the center of Kiev. The journey of Catherine II in 1787 was a trip with a prestige demonstration. The Empress went on this trip right after the annexation of the northern Black Sea coast and Crimea by the Russian Empire. The Empress showing off ended up being very expensive for the state at the time. The trip of the delegation that included about 3,000 foreigners, and that fact that new buildings were built and old ones were restored on the way of the cortege, cost the treasury 10 million rubles. All beggars were removed from Moscow. The expensive showing off of those times resembles the current situation with the Russian Mundial. And this trip was of a different nature than the sojourn of Elizabeth. Another thing that unites these two trips is that Catherine II was among the retinue of Elizabeth in 1744. Basically, the future Empress had come to Kiev even earlier and later as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, the bride of Tsar Peter III. He was the future emperor whom Catherine later overthrew, to which Kirill Razumovsky also contributed. By the way, Kiev did not impress Catherine all that much, despite the fact that a lot of different noblemen came here. According to the Empress herself, she liked Potemkin's Kremenchuk much more. The same can be said about Elizabeth. She had spent a month and a half in the city on the Dnipro River. The result of that stay was an expensive gift to Raphael Zaborovsky, namely the French coach that is exhibited in the National Museum of the History of Kiev. Watch in the next episode. Later, on the way back, she sent a sealed barrel with 80 bottles of English beer to Raphael Zaborovsky. In 1955, this coach underwent restoration. It even was regilded in some places. Raphael Zaborovsky's body remained in the St. Sophia Cathedral for 39 days and was imperishable, which was a sign of holiness.